The old abandoned mansion had always been a source of fear and intrigue for the townspeople. They whispered stories of its dark past and the mysterious disappearance of its former occupants. Some claimed to have seen ghosts lurking in its dusty windows, while others swore they heard strange noises emanating from within its walls. One summer evening, a group of teenagers decided to explore the mansion. They snuck in through a broken window, their flashlights illuminating the dusty interior. As they made their way through the old furniture and cobwebbed rooms, they laughed and joked, their fear subsiding with each step they took. But as they descended into the basement, a feeling of unease began to creep up on them. The air grew colder, and the sounds of their footsteps echoed ominously. Suddenly, one of the girls let out a blood-curdling scream as she stumbled upon a pile of bones in the corner of the room. The other teenagers rushed to her side, their fear now palpable. As they tried to calm themselves down, they heard a faint whisper coming from the darkness. It grew louder and more insistent until they could make out what it was saying. "Get out," the voice rasped. "Get out before it's too late." The teenagers froze in terror as the voice echoed through the basement. They couldn't see anyone, but the voice sounded close, as if it was right beside them. They looked at each other, their eyes wide with fear, and then scrambled to their feet, running towards the stairs. But as they reached the top of the staircase, they found that the door was shut. Panic set in as they realized that they were trapped inside the mansion. They pounded on the door, screaming for help, but there was no response. The only sound was the faint whispering voice, still urging them to leave. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and a deep silence fell over the mansion. The teenagers looked around nervously, their flashlights trembling in their hands. That's when they heard it, a soft shuffling sound, like something moving towards them. They turned around and saw a figure slowly emerging from the darkness. It was a tall, gaunt man with long, matted hair and a ragged beard. He wore tattered clothes and had a crazed look in his eyes. "Who are you?" one of the teenagers asked, his voice shaking. The man didn't answer. Instead, he started walking towards them, his arms outstretched as if he was going to grab them. The teenagers backed away, but they were trapped against the door. Suddenly, the man lunged at them, his hands reaching for their throats. The teenagers screamed and struggled, but he was too strong. One by one, he took them down, dragging them deeper into the mansion's shadows. The surviving teenagers, their hearts pounding in their chests, huddled together in a corner of the basement. They tried to stay quiet, hoping that the man wouldn't find them. But as they waited in the darkness, they heard something moving towards them. It was a low, dragging sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. They strained their ears, trying to make out what it was. Suddenly, they saw a faint light glowing in the distance, growing brighter and brighter until it filled the entire basement. As the light approached, they saw that it was coming from a strange, glowing orb that was hovering in the air. It seemed to be pulsing with an otherworldly energy, casting a sickly green glow on everything around it. The teenagers watched in horror as the orb moved towards them, its light illuminating the bones scattered across the floor. They tried to run, but their legs wouldn't move. They were paralyzed with fear, unable to escape the orb's terrible power. As the orb drew closer, they saw that it was inhabited by a sinister force, a malevolent entity that was not of this world. The force spoke to them, its voice echoing through the basement. "I am the master of this mansion," it said. "And you are my new guests. Welcome to your new home." The teenagers huddled together, frozen in fear as the sinister entity spoke to them. They knew they had to escape, but their legs wouldn't move, and their minds were clouded with terror. The entity continued to speak, its voice resonating through the basement like 1,000 whispers. It spoke of dark rituals, sacrifice, and ancient powers beyond human comprehension. The teenagers listened in horror, unable to break free from its grip. But suddenly, one of the teenagers broke free from the entity's hold. With a scream, she ran towards the stairs, the others following close behind. As they reached the top of the staircase, they saw that the door was still locked. They tried to break it down, but it wouldn't budge. The entity's voice grew louder, filling their heads with madness and terror. They were trapped, with no hope of escape. But then, one of the teenagers had an idea. They remembered an old legend about the mansion, that a secret passageway led from the basement to the outside world. They had heard that it was hidden behind a false wall in one of the rooms. They raced through the mansion, the entity's voice still echoing in their ears. They searched every room, but they couldn't find the false wall. Just as they were about to give up hope, they stumbled upon a hidden staircase, leading deep into the mansion's depths. Without hesitation, they descended into the darkness, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. As they reached the bottom of the staircase, they saw a faint light in the distance. It was the light of the outside world, beckoning them to safety. They ran towards it, their hearts pounding with excitement and fear. They burst through a hidden door and emerged into the night air, gasping for breath. As they looked back at the mansion, they saw the glowing orb hovering in the sky, its pulsating light casting a sickly green glow over everything. They knew that they had narrowly escaped the entity's grasp. But as they looked back at the mansion, they knew that it would always be a source of fear and darkness, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victims. The teenagers ran through the woods, their hearts still racing with fear. They knew that they had escaped the haunted mansion, but the memory of the entity and its malevolent voice haunted them. They couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they stumbled through the darkness, they heard a faint humming sound. It grew louder and louder until it filled their ears, drowning out all other sounds. They looked around, trying to find the source of the sound, but they couldn't see anything. Then, they heard a rustling in the bushes. They turned towards the sound, their flashlights trained on the spot. But there was nothing there, only the darkness of the woods. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. They stumbled and fell, unable to keep their balance. The shaking grew stronger and stronger until they felt as if the entire forest was coming apart. As they struggled to get back on their feet, they saw something moving towards them. It was a mass of writhing shadows, twisting and turning in the darkness. The teenagers tried to run, but the shadows seemed to surround them, cutting off their escape. They saw the glowing orb floating in the sky above them, casting its sickly green light on everything. The entity's voice filled their ears, speaking of ancient powers and dark rituals. The teenagers knew that they had to fight back, to find a way to break free from the entity's grasp. With a sudden burst of courage, they reached deep inside themselves, calling on their inner strength and determination. They focused all their energy on the entity, trying to force it back with the power of their minds. The entity fought back, its power growing stronger with each passing moment. But the teenagers refused to give up, knowing that their survival depended on their willpower. Finally, with a burst of energy, they broke free from the entity's grasp. The shadows dissipated, and the glowing orb vanished into the night sky. The teenagers looked around, amazed that they had defeated the entity. They knew that they would never forget their terrifying ordeal, but they also knew that they had come out of it stronger and more resilient. They left the haunted mansion behind, knowing that they had faced their fears and triumphed over them. The teenagers walked through the woods, the memory of their encounter with the entity still fresh in their minds. As they walked, they talked about what had happened, trying to make sense of the inexplicable events. But then, they heard a sound behind them. They turned around and saw the glowing orb floating towards them. The entity's voice filled their ears, speaking of ancient powers and dark rituals. The teenagers knew that they couldn't let the entity control them again. They stood their ground, ready to face the entity once more. As the glowing orb approached them, they focused all their energy on it, determined to defeat it once and for all. The entity fought back with all its might, but the teenagers refused to give up. With a final burst of energy, they defeated the entity. The glowing orb vanished, and the woods fell silent. The teenagers stood there, triumphant and relieved. But then, they heard a voice. It was a voice they recognized, but it sounded different somehow. They turned around and saw one of their friends, the one who had disappeared in the haunted mansion. The friend looked different, too. Their eyes were black and empty, and their skin was ashen and gray. They spoke in a cold, emotionless voice, telling the teenagers that they had failed. The teenagers realized with horror that their friend was no longer human. They had become a vessel for the entity, and it was using them to speak. The entity spoke through their friend, telling them that it would never be defeated. It would continue to haunt and torment them forever. The teenagers knew that they had to leave the woods to get as far away from the entity as possible. But they also knew that they could never truly escape it. As they walked away, they heard the entity's voice echoing in the darkness. It spoke of ancient powers and dark rituals, promising to return and claim them all. The teenagers knew that their ordeal was far from over. The entity would always be out there, waiting for its next victims. But they also knew that they had faced it once, and they could face it again if they had to. They left the woods behind, ready to face whatever horror might come their way. Months passed since the teenagers escaped the haunted mansion, but the memory of their encounter with the entity lingered. They tried to move on with their lives, but the fear and paranoia that the entity had left behind continued to haunt them. One night, as they sat around a campfire, they heard a rustling in the bushes. They looked around, but they couldn't see anything in the darkness. Then, they heard a voice. It was the entity's voice, speaking of ancient powers and dark rituals. The teenagers froze in terror, knowing that the entity had returned for them. They looked up and saw the glowing orb floating above them, casting its sickly green light on everything. The entity's voice grew stronger, filling their ears with its dark promises. But this time, the teenagers were ready. They had faced the entity before, and they knew that they could do it again. They stood up, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. With a burst of energy, they attacked the entity. They focused all their strength and determination on it, determined to defeat it once and for all. The entity fought back with all its might, but the teenagers refused to give up. They pushed harder and harder, their willpower driving them forward. Finally, with a flash of light, the entity vanished. The woods fell silent, and the teenagers were left standing there, triumphant and relieved. They looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. They realized that they had finally defeated the entity, and that they could move on with their lives. But then, they heard a voice behind them. It was the voice of their friend, the one who had become a vessel for the entity. The friend looked different, too. Their eyes were no longer black and empty, and their skin was no longer ashen and gray. They smiled at the teenagers, telling them that they were finally free. The teenagers looked at each other, relieved and grateful. They knew that their ordeal was over, and that they could finally move on. As they walked away from the campfire, they heard the sound of the wind in the trees. It was a soothing sound, a reminder that they had triumphed over the darkness. But as they walked, they also heard a faint humming sound. It was a sound they recognized, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. the teenagers realized with horror that the entity was not gone. It was still out there, waiting for its next victims. They walked away from the woods, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that the entity would always be there, lurking in the darkness. They knew that they had faced their fears and triumphed over them, but they also knew that they could never truly escape the horror that they had experienced.